Spring 1966. The Crawfield sisters were found alive in the Appalachians. Then came the confession. In the rolling hills of eastern Kentucky, where the morning mist clings to the hollows like a shroud refusing to lift, there exists a kind of silence that speaks louder than words. It is a silence born of secrets, kept for generations, of doors that remain closed to outsiders, and of family bonds that have grown so tangled they have become chains. This is the story of the Crawfield family, a name that would become synonymous with one of the most disturbing cases of generational isolation ever documented in the American South. What began as a routine welfare check by a young social worker would unravel a web of secrets spanning nearly 4 decades, revealing the devastating consequences of a family that had turned inward upon itself in ways that defied comprehension. The year was 1966. Lyndon B. Johnson occupied the White House. The Vietnam War dominated the evening news, and in the remote reaches of Letcher County, Kentucky, a family had been living in almost complete isolation since the early years of the Great Depression. Margaret Ellen Hayes was 26 years old when she accepted her position with the Kentucky Department of Child Welfare. Fresh from her training in Frankfort, she had been assigned to cover the most remote districts of the Appalachian region, areas where roads turned to mud in spring, where electricity remained a luxury, and where outsiders were regarded with deep suspicion. On the morning of April 14, 1966, Margaret received a peculiar report. A traveling minister named Reverend Thomas Whitley had attempted to visit a property deep in the hills near the community of Thornton Gap. What he had witnessed there had disturbed him so profoundly that he had driven 40 miles to the nearest telephone to alert authorities. The Reverend described seeing several figures moving behind the windows of a dilapidated farmhouse, figures that moved strangely with awkward gaits and unusual postures. When he had approached the property, an elderly man had emerged with a shotgun, warning him that his kind was not welcome on Crawfield land. But it was what the Reverend heard that truly haunted him, the sound of children crying. Not the ordinary crying of youngsters at play or in minor distress, but something else entirely. Something that sounded, in his words, like wounded animals. Margaret reviewed the county records that afternoon. The Crawfield property had been in the same family since 1887, when Ezekiel Crawfield had purchased 200 acres of timberland following his discharge from a logging company. The property had passed to his son, then to his grandson. Tax records showed the land was currently registered to one Harlan Crawfield, age 63. But here was where the records became strange. There were no birth certificates on file for any children born on the property after 1931. No school enrollment records. No medical records of any kind. For the Kentucky welfare system, the Crawfield family had essentially ceased to exist on paper 35 years prior. Margaret requested a sheriff's deputy to accompany her to the property. Deputy Franklin Reeves was a veteran lawman who had spent his entire career in Letcher County. When Margaret showed him the location on the map, his face grew pale. "The Crawfield place," he said quietly. "My daddy used to warn me about going up that hollow when I was a boy. Said those folks kept to themselves for good reason. The drive took nearly 2 hours along roads that barely deserved the name. The final 3 miles required them to proceed on foot as the path had become too overgrown for the patrol car." As they climbed deeper into the hollow, Margaret noticed something peculiar. There were no sounds of wildlife. No bird song, no rustling in the underbrush. Just that oppressive silence that seemed to press against her ears. The Crawfield homestead came into view just past noon. It was a collection of structures that seemed to have grown organically from the hillside, a main house of weathered gray timber, several outbuildings in various states of decay, and what appeared to be additional living quarters constructed from salvaged materials. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys despite the warming spring air. Deputy Reeves called out their presence. For several long minutes, nothing stirred. Then the front door of the main house creaked open, and a figure emerged. Harlan Crawfield was 63 years old, but he appeared far older. His spine curved dramatically, forcing him to walk with his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His eyes, Margaret noted with a chill, were set unusually close together, and one hand appeared to have only 3 fingers. When he spoke, his words were thick and difficult to understand, as though his tongue struggled to form proper sounds. "No business here," Harlan said. "Crawfield business is Crawfield business." Margaret explained their purpose, a welfare check following a concerned citizen's report. She assured him they meant no harm, that they simply needed to verify the well-being of any children on the property. What happened next would haunt Margaret for the remainder of her life. Harlan Crawfield began to laugh. It was a terrible sound, wheezing and broken. And then he said words that changed everything. Children? Ain't been children here in years. Just the sisters now. The Crawfield sisters. You want to see them? Fine, you see them. Then you leave and never come back. He turned and walked toward one of the outbuildings, a structure that Margaret had assumed was a barn or storage shed. Deputy Reeves kept his hand on his service revolver as they followed. Harlan produced a key from a chain around his neck. The padlock was heavy, rusted. It took him several attempts to work the mechanism. And then the door swung open, releasing an odor so powerful that Margaret staggered backward. In the dim light filtering through gaps in the wooden walls, Margaret saw them. 4 women sat on makeshift beds arranged in a row. They ranged in age from what appeared to be late 20s to early 40s. Each of them bore the unmistakable signs of severe genetic abnormalities. One woman's head was noticeably smaller than normal, her eyes wide and unfocused. Another had a spine curved so severely that she could not sit upright. A third had hands that ended in fused digits, the fingers melted together like candle wax. The fourth appeared the most physically normal but rocked continuously back and forth, making sounds that were not quite words. These were the Crawfield sisters. Margaret would later write in her report that the conditions in which these women were kept defied description. The building had no running water, no proper sanitation. The women had apparently lived in this structure for years, perhaps decades, cared for by the very family that had created them. Deputy Reeves radioed for assistance. Within hours, the hollow that had remained hidden from the outside world for so long was filled with the sounds of vehicles, voices, and the whir of camera equipment as state officials documented what they had found. But the discovery of the sisters was only the beginning. The true horror of the Crawfield family would not become clear until the confessions began. Confira se Jr. inscrito nest canal, se historias q revelum os segredos meis sombrios historia americana facem su coracao bader meis forte into evoca precisa phaser part desta comunidade. Inscriva-se agora, porco q vema seguir via madar completamente como voca entende esta familia. The investigation into the Crawfield family would consume the resources of 3 separate state agencies over the following 18 months. What emerged from interviews, property records, and the painstaking reconstruction of family history was a portrait of isolation, so complete that it had created what one medical examiner would later describe as a closed genetic loop. To understand how the Crawfield sisters came to exist, one must travel back nearly 8 decades to the original settlement of the property. Ezekiel Crawfield arrived in Letcher County in 1887. A man fleeing something, though historical records never made clear exactly what. He was 41 years old, accompanied by a wife named Constance, and 4 children ranging in age from 8 to 16. They were not welcomed by the scattered communities of the region, who found Ezekiel's manner strange and his wife's silence unsettling. The Crawfields purchased their land in cash, an unusual transaction for the time and place. They built their homestead deep in a hollow accessible only by a single narrow path. Within the first year, they had ceased all contact with neighboring families. What happened within the Crawfield homestead over the following decades would only become clear through the investigation of 1966. But certain facts were established beyond doubt. Ezekiel Crawfield had brought with him a particular interpretation of biblical scripture, one that emphasized the importance of keeping bloodlines pure. He believed that his family had been chosen for a special purpose, and that mixing with outsiders would dilute this divine selection. He preached these beliefs to his children with the fervor of absolute conviction. When Ezekiel's eldest son, Jacob, reached marriageable age, there was no question of seeking a wife from outside the family. Jacob was wed to his younger sister Ruth in a ceremony conducted by Ezekiel himself in 1894. This union produced 6 children. 3 died in infancy from causes that were never recorded. The 3 who survived, 2 sons and a daughter, all bore visible signs of their parentage. One son was deaf from birth. The daughter's legs were of noticeably different lengths, causing her to walk with a severe limp. The second son appeared relatively healthy but suffered from fits that would overtake him without warning. The pattern established by Jacob and Ruth would continue through subsequent generations. The family had created a system of rotation, carefully documented in a ledger that investigators would discover hidden beneath the floorboards of the main house. This ledger, written in Ezekiel's distinctive hand and continued by his descendants, tracked the unions between family members with the cold precision of livestock breeding records. By the time Harlan Crawfield was born in 1903, the family had already experienced 3 generations of this practice. Harlan was the product of a union between first cousins. His physical abnormalities, the curved spine, the missing fingers, the difficulty with speech were among the milder manifestations of the genetic damage accumulating within the bloodline. Harlan had 4 siblings. 2 died before reaching adulthood. 1 surviving brother had been born without eyes. His sockets were present, but the organs themselves had never developed. This brother, named Ezekiel after the family patriarch, lived until 1951, cared for in the same outbuilding where the sisters would later be confined. The sisters themselves, Alma, Bessie, Clara, and Dorothea, were born between 1924 and 1938. They were the daughters of Harlan and his first cousin, a woman named Patience, who had died during the birth of the youngest, Dorothea. Investigators interviewing Harlan in the weeks following the discovery would struggle to extract coherent information from him. His cognitive abilities were limited, and he seemed to genuinely not understand why outsiders would find his family's practices troubling. He spoke of the sisters as both daughters and something else, a category that had no name in conventional family structures. "They's Crawfields," he would repeat when pressed. "Same as me. Same as my daddy. Same as his daddy before. We keep to ourselves. That's the way it's always been." The medical examinations of the 4 sisters revealed the full extent of the damage wrought by decades of closed breeding. All 4 women showed chromosomal abnormalities consistent with high levels of consanguinity. Their conditions included microcephaly, scoliosis, fused digits, cognitive impairment ranging from mild to severe, and a host of other developmental issues. Dr. Harrison Cole, a geneticist from the University of Kentucky who was consulted on the case, would later write a paper describing his findings. He estimated that the genetic diversity within the Crawfield family had decreased to levels typically seen only in severely inbred animal populations. The sisters, he noted, shared genetic markers at a rate suggesting their parents were more closely related than typical first cousins, indicating that the family tree had doubled back upon itself multiple times. But the physical conditions of the sisters, disturbing as they were, represented only part of the tragedy. Their psychological states were equally devastating. Alma, the eldest at 42, possessed the highest cognitive function of the 4. She could speak in simple sentences and demonstrated an understanding of her circumstances that made her situation all the more heartbreaking. During interviews with social workers, she would ask repeatedly when she could return home, not seeming to understand that the place of her captivity was the only home she had ever known. Bessie, 38, had been born with severe hearing impairment and had never developed proper speech. She communicated through a system of gestures that only her sisters seemed to understand. Her medical examination revealed that she had given birth at some point in the past, a discovery that sent investigators back to the Crawfield property with renewed urgency. Clara, 34, was the one with the severely curved spine. She spent most of her time in a fetal position, apparently in significant pain. Medical staff would later determine that her spinal condition had never received any treatment whatsoever. With proper medical intervention in childhood, much of her suffering could have been prevented. Dorothea, the youngest at 28, was the one who rocked continuously and made sounds instead of words. She had been born with a cleft palate that had healed poorly without surgical intervention, leaving her face permanently disfigured and her ability to eat or speak severely compromised. She was also, investigators would discover, the mother of 2 children who had died in infancy. The revelation that Bessie and Dorothea had both experienced pregnancies opened a new and more disturbing chapter in the investigation. Who had fathered these children? The sisters had been confined to the property their entire lives. The only males present were family members. When confronted with this question, Harlan Crawfield showed no shame or confusion. He answered as though the question itself was strange. "Crawfields make Crawfields," he said. "That's the way. The children born to Bessie and Dorothea, at least for that could be, confirmed through Harlan's limited testimony, had all died within their first year of life. Their bodies had been buried in a small plot behind the main house, marked only with stones. When investigators excavated this area, they found remains consistent with infants who had suffered from severe genetic abnormalities incompatible with life. The scope of the tragedy was becoming clear. The Crawfield family had not merely isolated themselves from the outside world. They had created a closed system of reproduction that had, over 4 generations, produced increasing levels of disability, suffering, and death. The sisters found in that outbuilding were not anomalies. They were the inevitable result of decisions made 8 decades prior. And yet, as investigators would soon discover, the full truth was even more complicated than it appeared. for the Crawfield family had not acted entirely alone. There were others in the region who had known, who had suspected, who had chosen to look away. The confession that would shake the foundations of the community was yet to come. The community of Thornton Gap in 1966 consisted of approximately 300 souls scattered across the hollows and ridges of eastern Letcher County. It was a place where families had lived for generations, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where certain subjects were simply never discussed. As state investigators widened their inquiry beyond the Crawfield property, they encountered a wall of silence that proved nearly impenetrable. Neighbors who lived within a few miles of the Crawfield homestead claimed they had never seen anything unusual. Shopkeepers in the nearest town, where Harlan Crawfield had occasionally appeared to purchase supplies, insisted they had noticed nothing wrong. Even the local postmaster, who had delivered mail to the property for over 20 years, maintained that he had never observed anything that would warrant a report. But the evidence told a different story. Margaret Hayes, the social worker who had made the initial discovery, began interviewing elderly residents of the area. She was looking for anyone who might remember the earlier generations of Crawfields, anyone who might shed light on how the family had managed to exist in such complete isolation for so long. She found was not ignorance, it was complicity. Elmer Hoskins was 87 years old in 1966, one of the oldest residents of Thornton Gap. His family had lived in the region for over a century, and his memory stretched back to the earliest years of the Crawfield settlement. When Margaret visited his small cabin on the outskirts of the community, he initially refused to speak with her. "Some things ain't meant to be dug up," he told her through the screen door. "Let the dead rest. Let the living be." But Margaret persisted. She returned to Elmer's cabin 3 times before he finally agreed to talk. What he revealed would reshape the entire investigation. "We knew," Elmer admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone knew, not the details maybe. Not exactly what went on up in that hollow, but we knew it wasn't right. We knew those people wasn't living like normal folk." Elmer explained that his own father had visited the Crawfield property in 1912, shortly after the death of the original patriarch Ezekiel. What he had seen there, children with obvious deformities, adults who could barely communicate, a family that seemed to exist outside the bounds of normal society, had disturbed him deeply. "My daddy came home that night and he sat in his chair for hours without saying a word," Elmer recalled. "Finally, my mama asked him what was wrong. He said he'd seen something that day that made him question whether God was paying attention to this world at all. But Elmer's father had not reported what he had seen. Neither had anyone else in the community." The reasons, Elmer explained, were complicated. First, there was the practical matter of jurisdiction and authority. In the early 20th century, the hollows of eastern Kentucky existed largely outside the reach of state government. There was no welfare system to speak of, no social workers trained to handle such situations. The law, such as it was, concerned itself with obvious crimes, theft, violence, property disputes. What happened within a family on private property was considered no one else's business. Second, there was fear. The Crawfields, for all their isolation, were not passive victims of their circumstances. They actively defended their separation from the outside world. Stories circulated about outsiders who had ventured too close to the property and been met with threats. One tale, which Elmer could not verify but believed to be true, involved a revenue agent in the 1920s who had gone to investigate reports of illegal distilling on Crawfield land and had never been seen again. Third, and perhaps most significantly, there was a cultural reluctance to interfere with the practices of others, no matter how troubling. The communities of Appalachia had developed their own codes of conduct over generations of isolation and poverty. Minding one's own business was not just a preference, it was a survival strategy. "We had enough trouble keeping ourselves alive through the hard times," Elmer said. "The Depression hit this place like a hammer. Folks was dying of hunger, of sickness, of simple despair. Nobody had the energy or the inclination to go poking into other people's affairs." But Elmer's confession went further. He revealed that the community had not merely ignored the Crawfields, they had actively enabled their isolation. When Harlan Crawfield would appear in town to purchase supplies, merchants would fill his orders without question. When property taxes came due, the county assessor would accept payment without requiring an inspection of the land. When census takers came through the region, they were quietly warned away from certain properties. "We made a kind of peace with it," Elmer admitted. "We told ourselves that whatever was happening up in that hollow, it wasn't hurting anyone outside the family. We told ourselves that it wasn't our place to interfere. We told ourselves a lot of things that let us sleep at night." The interview with Elmer Hoskins was the first crack in the wall of silence. Others followed. As word spread that the investigation was serious, that state authorities were determined to understand how the situation had developed. More residents came forward with their own confessions. A former school teacher named Viola Patterson admitted that she had once seen one of the Crawfield children, a girl with obvious physical abnormalities, watching her classroom from the tree line in the early 1940s. She had reported the sighting to the county superintendent, who had told her in no uncertain terms to forget what she had seen. A retired minister named Reverend George Calhoun confessed that he had visited the Crawfield property in 1953, hoping to offer spiritual guidance to the family. What he had witnessed there had shaken his faith to its core. He had chosen to keep silent, convincing himself that God would sort out the situation in his own time. A former county judge named Harold Brennan, who had served on the bench from 1948 to 1962, admitted that he had received at least 2 reports about unusual activities on the Crawfield property during his tenure. Both times, he had declined to pursue the matter, citing a lack of evidence and a reluctance to interfere with private family affairs. The confessions painted a picture of institutional failure that extended far beyond simple negligence. The Crawfield family had existed in a kind of protected bubble, shielded from outside intervention by a combination of fear, cultural norms, and deliberate avoidance. The tragedy that had unfolded over 4 generations had been enabled by the silence of an entire community. Margaret Hayes compiled these testimonies into a supplemental report that would become one of the most cited documents in the subsequent reforms to Kentucky's child welfare system. The report concluded that the Crawfield case represented not merely a family tragedy but a systemic failure, a failure of social institutions, legal authorities, and community responsibility. Se voca esta sintiendo o peso desta historia como eu senta escrivala doxum comitero dizendo silencio também culpado porcas vezes maior crueldade now o que fazemos o que escolhemos now ver. The confessions from Thornton Gap would have significant legal implications. Several individuals, including former Judge Brennan, would face questions about their failure to act. But in the legal framework of 1966, there was little recourse. No laws had been clearly broken by those who had chosen to look away. Their sin was one of omission, not commission, and yet the moral weight of their silence would follow them for the rest of their lives. Elmer Hoskins, in one of his final interviews before his death in 1968, offered a haunting summary of the community's complicity. "We knew," he repeated, "and knowing, we did nothing. Those girls spent their whole lives in that hollow, suffering in ways I can't even imagine, and we let it happen. We let it happen because it was easier than doing what was right." The Crawfield case forced an entire region to confront uncomfortable truths about the limits of community responsibility and the cost of chosen ignorance. But the investigation was far from over. The most devastating revelations were still to come. For Harlan Crawfield was finally ready to provide a full confession, and what he revealed would expose secrets that had been buried even deeper than the bodies behind the farmhouse. The interrogation of Harlan Crawfield took place over 7 days in May of 1966. The sessions were conducted at the Letcher County Sheriff's Office with representatives from the State Welfare Department, the County Prosecutor's Office, and a court-appointed psychiatrist in attendance. The challenges of obtaining coherent testimony from Harlan were considerable. His cognitive limitations made it difficult for him to follow complex questions or provide detailed chronological accounts. His speech impediment required interviewers to frequently ask for clarification, and his worldview, shaped by a lifetime of isolation and indoctrination, meant that he often failed to understand why certain questions were being asked at all. Nevertheless, over the course of those 7 days, a picture emerged of life within the Crawfield family that was more disturbing than even the investigators had anticipated. Harlan began with his own childhood. He'd been born in 1903, the third of 5 children produced by the union of first cousins. His earliest memories were of the hollow, the gray timber walls of the farmhouse, the smell of wood smoke, the faces of family members that blurred together in his recollection. He remembered learning at a very young age that the outside world was dangerous. His father, a man named Solomon Crawfield, had taught him that outsiders carried diseases, both physical and spiritual. Mixing with them would corrupt the family's pure bloodline and bring divine punishment upon them all. "Daddy showed me the book," Harlan said, referring to the ledger that investigators had already discovered. "He showed me all the names, going back to great-granddaddy Ezekiel. He said we was a special family, chosen by God. He said we had to keep ourselves separate to stay pure. The lessons had been reinforced through strict discipline. Any curiosity about the outside world was punished severely." Harlan bore scars on his back from beatings he had received as a child for asking about the people who lived beyond the hollow. As Harlan grew older, he came to understand his role within the family system. Like the males before him, he was expected to continue the bloodline with female family members. This was not presented as a choice, but as a sacred duty, something ordained by God and enforced by family tradition. It wasn't something we talked about, Harlan explained, struggling to find words for concepts he had never been required to articulate. It was just what we did, what everyone had always done. I didn't know there was any other way. Harlan was first paired with his cousin Patience when he was 17 years old. She was 15. Neither of them had ever interacted with anyone outside the family. Neither of them had any concept of the world beyond the hollow. Their union and their understanding was simply the natural order of things. Patience gave birth to her first child, a daughter who died within hours in 1921. She would go on to bear 5 more children over the following 17 years. 2 died in infancy. One son survived to adulthood but suffered from severe mental impairment and died during a seizure in 1959. 2 daughters, Alma and Bessie, were the eldest of the sisters found in the outbuilding. But Patience was not Harlan's only partner. The family system required multiple unions to maintain the population. Harlan was also paired with his sister Marianne, producing 2 children before her death from complications in 1935. One of those children was Clara, the sister with the curved spine. The youngest sister, Dorothea, was the product of Harlan's union with yet another relative, a woman whose precise relationship to him the investigators struggled to determine given the family's tangled genealogy. She may have been a niece, a cousin, or something in between. In the closed loop of Crawfield genetics, such distinctions had become meaningless. Harlan's testimony about the deaths of children was particularly difficult for investigators to hear. He spoke of these losses with a matter-of-factness that seemed almost casual, as though infant mortality was simply an expected part of life, a regular occurrence that required no special mourning. Babies died, he said with a shrug. Always did. The weak ones went back to God. The strong ones stayed. When asked how many children had been born on the property during his lifetime, Harlan was unable to provide a specific number. His best estimate was somewhere between 30 and 40. How many had survived to adulthood? He counted on his fingers, his brow furrowing with concentration. Perhaps 12, maybe 15. He couldn't be sure. The children who survived faced lives of hardship and limitation. None received any formal education. Medical care was non-existent. Their entire existence was confined to the hollow and the practices of the family. Harlan explained that females were categorized from an early age based on their capacity for reproduction. Those who appeared physically capable were groomed for union with male family members. Those whose disabilities rendered them unable to bear children were put to work on household tasks. Those who could not even manage simple labor were confined to the outbuilding, the same structure, where the 4 sisters had been found. The males faced a different classification system. Those who appeared physically capable were assigned reproductive duties and trained in the basic skills needed to maintain the property. Those with severe impairments were kept alive as long as they could be useful, then allowed to fade away when they became too burdensome to maintain. We took care of our own, Harlan insisted repeatedly throughout his testimony. That's what family does. We didn't ask nothing from nobody. We just lived our way. When asked about the children born to Bessie and Dorothea, his daughters who had themselves become mothers, Harlan's confusion about the nature of the investigation became most apparent. He genuinely did not understand why this aspect of the family's practices was considered problematic. They was of age, he said. They could bear, so they bore. That's the way. The fathers of these children, as investigators had already suspected, were male family members, likely including Harlan himself, though he would not confirm this directly. The children had all died, their genetic abnormalities too severe to permit survival. The psychiatric evaluation conducted during the interrogation concluded that Harlan suffered from significant cognitive impairment, likely the result of his own consanguineous origins. His ability to understand abstract concepts, including moral reasoning, was severely limited. He was not feigning confusion about the wrongness of his family's practices. He genuinely could not comprehend why outsiders viewed them as abhorrent. The prosecutors faced a dilemma. Harlan Crawfield had presided over a system of practices that had caused immeasurable suffering, but his own capacity to understand the nature of his actions was fundamentally compromised. Holding him fully accountable would require establishing a level of criminal intent that his mental state could not support. In the end, Harlan was not charged with any crimes related to the reproductive practices within the family. The legal framework of 1966 simply did not provide clear mechanisms for prosecuting such situations. He was instead committed to a state institution for the mentally impaired, where he would spend the remaining years of his life. but his confession had served its purpose. The full scope of the Crawfield tragedy was now documented: 4 generations of isolation, dozens of lives warped by genetic damage, an unknown number of children born only to die from abnormalities too severe to survive. The sisters remained the living testament to this history. Their fate now lay in the hands of a system that had failed to protect them for their entire lives. The 4 Crawfield sisters were transferred to the Eastern Kentucky State Hospital in Lexington in June of 1966. For the first time in their lives, they received comprehensive medical care, proper nutrition, and living conditions that met basic standards of human dignity. The adjustment was difficult. Alma, the most cognitively capable of the sisters, experienced severe anxiety when separated from her siblings. She had spent her entire life in the company of family members, and the hospital environment with its unfamiliar faces and strange procedures was overwhelming. For the first several months, she would only eat if all 4 sisters were together in the same room. Bessie, despite her hearing impairment, adapted more quickly. She seemed to find comfort in the predictability of hospital routines, regular meals, clean bedding, staff who treated her with kindness. She developed a close relationship with one of the nurses, a woman named Patricia Howard, who learned her system of gestures and became her primary caregiver. Clara's medical treatment was more intensive. Surgeons determined that some of her spinal damage could be partially corrected, and she underwent a series of operations over the following 2 years. While she would never walk normally, the procedures significantly reduced her pain and improved her quality of life. Dorothea remained the most challenging case. Her psychological condition combined with her physical disabilities required constant specialized care. She never fully adjusted to life outside the hollow, and staff reported that she would sometimes cry out in her sleep, making sounds that resembled the name of her father. The legal proceedings surrounding the Crawfield property concluded in late 1966. The land was seized by the state under provisions allowing for the confiscation of property used in the commission of illegal acts. The buildings were demolished and the site was allowed to return to wilderness. Today there is no visible trace of the homestead that harbored such darkness for so many decades. The community of Thornton Gap underwent its own reckoning in the years following the discovery. Several of the individuals who had confessed to knowledge of the family's situation faced informal social sanctions, exclusion from community events, loss of business, the quiet ostracism that small communities can impose on those who violate their moral codes, even when those codes had previously permitted the very silence they now condemned. Former Judge Harold Brennan resigned from his position shortly after the investigation concluded, citing health reasons. He died in 1971 without ever publicly addressing his failure to act on the reports he had received. The Crawfield case contributed to significant reforms in Kentucky's approach to child welfare and vulnerable adult protection. New reporting requirements were implemented, mandating that certain professionals, doctors, teachers, law enforcement report suspected situations of neglect or harm. Funding was increased for social services in remote areas, and the case became a teaching example in social work programs throughout the region. Dr. Harrison Cole, the geneticist who had studied the family's chromosomal abnormalities, continued his research into the effects of consanguinity. His work contributed to a broader scientific understanding of how genetic diversity protects populations from hereditary diseases. He often cited the Crawfield family as an extreme example of the damage that can accumulate when a gene pool becomes too closed. The sisters lived out their remaining years at various state facilities. Bessie passed away in 1978 from complications related to a cardiac condition that had gone undiagnosed for her entire life, a condition that likely had genetic origins. Clara followed in 1982, her body finally succumbing to the cumulative effects of her spinal abnormalities. Dorothea, despite her fragile condition, survived until 1987, outliving all her sisters. Alma, the eldest and most aware of the form, lived the longest. She passed away in 1991 at the age of 67. By the end of her life, she had learned to read simple words and could communicate in basic sentences. In her final years, she would sometimes speak about the hollow, her memories fragmentary but persistent. "It was all I knew," she told a nurse shortly before her death. "I didn't know it was wrong. I didn't know there was anything else." Patricia Howard, the nurse who had befriended Bessie, attended Alma's funeral. She was one of only a handful of people present. As she later recalled, she felt that she was saying goodbye not just to a woman but to an entire chapter of American history, a chapter that most people would prefer to forget. The Crawfield case stands as a stark reminder of what can happen when isolation becomes absolute, when family bonds become chains, and when communities choose silence over intervention. It is a story without villains, in the conventional sense, only victims of circumstances that spiraled beyond any individual's control. sustained by a culture of secrecy that allowed darkness to flourish unchecked. Spring 1966, the Crawfield sisters were found alive in the Appalachians. Then came the confession. And with that confession came a reckoning that would echo through the hollows of eastern Kentucky for generations. Some secrets, it seems, are too terrible to remain buried forever. And some truths, once exposed, cannot be forgotten. The hollow where the Crawfields lived for 8 decades is silent now, reclaimed by the forest that had always surrounded it. But those who know the history of the place still speak of it in whispers, as if afraid that the ghosts of 4 sisters might somehow hear. And perhaps that is fitting, for the Crawfield sisters spent their lives in silence, prisoners of a family that had turned inward upon itself until nothing remained but suffering. The least we can do is remember them. The least we can do is speak their names. Alma, Bessie, Clara, Dorothea, the Crawfield sisters. May they finally rest in peace. Se voca assistiu 8 acia porcadestu dessa historia. Doc sum commentare dizendo eu assistiate acim. Para que eu passate conhecer e saber quem realmente gosta das historias aqui do canal. Se esta historia taku voca de alguma forma dexu like alajuda mais pessoas a descobrir messes relatos que precisam ser contados. Compartilhas video com alguém que aprecia historias reais que revelam os lados mais sombrios da humanidade. Juntos, mantemos vivas as memorias daqueles que foram esquecidos. E se voca, ainda não inscrito, inscreva-se agora, e ativo sino de notificações. Novos casos são revelados toda semana, e voca nova vai querer perder nenhum deles. 8 APR, as zima historia.